and welcome to Wrestling at Random. I'm Jeremy Deemer.
And I am Adam Summers.
This is the podcast where every week we review a classic pro wrestling event from a streaming service.
And when we say classic pro wrestling event, that can be pretty much anything that isn't a weekly TV show. So it could be a pay-per-view, it could be a major special, it could be a live event of significance, but not your weekly Monday Night Raw or WCW Saturday Night or anything like that.
And sometimes it'll be something good, sometimes something bad. We'll always have fun recapping it. And this week, we've got a little bit of the, there was some good stuff, but man, a lot of bad memories coming back to me on this one. It's WWE Vengeance from December 9th, 2001. Now, let me take you back to 2001, and World Championship Wrestling had just been canceled on all of the Turner networks, which meant the company assets were going to be put up for sale, and WCW was purchased by Vince McMahon, owner of the World Wrestling Federation, for a price of $2.5 million. Finally putting an end to a rivalry that had been going on since the 1980s. The war had been won, and it was won by Vince. WWF production and creative at this time were also impacted by the spring 2001 launch of Vince's XFL Football League. Heading into that summer, the WCW invasion angle, the WWF chose not to bring in most of the established WCW stars, including Ric Flair, and they waited until it was just too late. They eventually would add ECW to the invasion story, teaming with WCW to create the Alliance. With the exception of the Invasion pay-per-view that summer, all promotion versus promotion business was completely mishandled. Bad booking decisions, frequent turns, frequent title changes, and a lack of star power on the WCW side, and also just never allowing the WWF to look weak or threatened by this invasion.
Well, yeah, the idea was basically they won the war legitimately, and then basically the rest of the invasion storyline, they had to pound it into your head that they were winning the war again in storyline, which does not make for making money.
Making Shane and Stephanie the faces of WCW and ECW also removed the entire outsider feel from the invasion story.
And by the way, making ECW and WCW friendly when ECW, yes, was an anti-WWF company, but it was even more so an anti-WCW company, and the ECW fans mostly despised WCW and their fans.
And you mentioned it wasn't good for business. According to Dave Meltzer of the Wrestling Observer, on January 29th, there were 5.6 million adults over the age of 25 watching professional wrestling. That number fell 57%, down to 2.4 million by the fall of 2001.
Yeah, I mean, I can just, as an aside here, as someone who grew up a WCW fan, still paid attention to WCW and watched it, but as they started to wilt and die, my interest in ECW only picked up. This was the darkest time period for me as a pro wrestling fan in terms of whether I was going to stay a fan or not, which seems ridiculous to think back on now, but you had WCW die, ECW die. While I was very interested in Japan at that point, it was nowhere near as easy to watch stuff as it is now. That's an understatement. And pretty much, unless you had a very good indie promotion near you, which again, that was not as likely back then as it would be several years later, WWF was, for the most part, what you were stuck with. And as a fan that was basically coming over from being a fan of other companies, they did not do much for you to feel welcome. It was basically
No.
All the guys you liked, we're going to tell you they sucked, we're going to show you they sucked, and then we're going to run you off. And you know, it didn't quite happen with me, but it was pretty close.
The Survivor Series in November that year officially marked the end of the Alliance and the WCW and ECW names. And that leads us into this show here in December. We're looking at Vengeance 2001, and we open up with a video package. We've got Fred Blassie watching old wrestling. We've got
Yes, it
Buddy
starts
Rogers.
off promising.
Yeah, so we see clips of Buddy Rogers, and then we see Since the Beginning, there has never been one undisputed champion. Clips of Bruno Sammartino, Billy Graham, Bob Backlund, Iron Sheik, all the WWF champs, and then you see Ric Flair and the NWA or WCW Big Gold Belt. You got Hogan, Savage, Sting, Warrior, Nash, Michaels, until tonight. And Blassie drops his cane, dances with a ghost, and we see on the screen 4 superstars, 3 matches, 2 titles, 1 undisputed champion. And I'm like, yeah, maybe this show wasn't half bad. It was definitely a promising start. It tried to make you think you were going to see something important, special, monumental. We'll see how it goes, because a lot of people also anticipated to see that, because in the San Diego Sports Arena where this event was held, it was a sold-out crowd. There was 11,800 fans paying just over $550,000. That was an all-time gate for pro wrestling in San Diego.
Yeah, JR referenced it, by the way, as the all-time record for a family event in this arena.
And they also...
And boy, did it not seem like a family event at times as we move through this
it might have been
sports
more
entertainment program.
Might have been more family-friendly if you couldn't hear the commentators. And
yeah, true.
And then they also pulled in another $100,696 in merchandise sales. We've got clips from WWF New York in Times Square. I forgot that ever existed.
Yes, the restaurant that the WWF had in Times Square. Back
when themed restaurants were all the rage.
Yes, this was basically the answer to Hard Rock Cafe, Planet Hollywood, Rainforest Cafe, even NASCAR Cafe. Everybody was opening a themed, relatively generic restaurant. And I mean, the story with WWF New York was basically when they would show they've got a pay-per-view party, or it's Monday Night Raw, and it looks like people are hanging off the rafters. Well, they were, but pretty much any other time, it was not exactly a rockin' joint.
Jim Ross and King Lawler are our announcers. The returning Jerry the King Lawler, he had quit earlier in the year when they fired his wife, and then when she left Lawler for another wrestler, she's no longer his wife. He made amends and ended up coming back. So this was one of his big returns.
Unfortunate that happened right before this show, because boy, was Jerry Lawler at his worst on this program.
Yeah, and the events leading up to this, we had a heavy dose of Paul Heyman prior to the return of Jerry Lawler, and he is so much better as a color commentator than Jerry the King Lawler. It's unbelievable.
It was a weird situation too, because with Heyman, ECW was not officially dead. Like, everybody knew it was probably dead. They had shows, I believe, in like Arkansas that were kind of like had the feeling of a final send off, but there was nothing official. They had a pay-per-view schedule that ended up not happening, but it was still, if I remember correctly, that pay-per-view was still on the books when Paul E showed up replacing Jerry Lawler, and initially wearing an ECW hat. And this was before they did anything with the ECW invasion, which, if you remember, that angle was amazing. Like, that happened maybe halfway or 2/3 through that episode of Raw, where the ECW invasion sort of started. But then by the very end of that same show, it was revealed that Stephanie McMahon was the owner of ECW, and they were with WCW, and it went from hot to not very quickly.
And I was pretty excited when I heard the voice of Howard Finkel as my ring announcer.
Yes. They didn't show him, though. Did you notice that? Which, again, because they thought he was too old. They did not show him. Did they even mention him? I don't even think we saw like a graphic or anything. It was just we heard the voice of Howard Finkel, which better than nothing.
Yeah, what an awesome voice, as always. And he announced Vince McMahon coming out to open the show. and he's coming out for a long interview segment here
at the beginning of a pay-per-view. This is not, if you fired this up, you might have thought that the glitchy WWE network had given you a Monday Night Raw episode instead, but this was in fact Vengeance, a pay-per-view.
Vince was in a bad mood because Rikishi had given him a stink face here. He'd had his face shoved in Rikishi's ass. This immediately brought me back to PTSD around the whole Vince McMahon kiss my ass club angle and awful stuff. So Vince comes out, he recaps what happened, which was good because I needed a recap on where we were storyline wise. Ric Flair and Vince McMahon at this point are 50-50 partners in owning the WWF.
It's one of it's one of those early WWF speak things. Throughout the show, they never ever refer to them as co-owners. They are 50-50 partners, just like what is happening tonight in the run up to there being an undisputed champion. It is not once referred to as a tournament or a one night tournament. It is a 3-match series, I believe Jim Ross refers to it as, but they absolutely make sure to never say tournament.
Now so we get the recap of The Rock shoving Vince's face into Rikishi's ass, and there was one really good line in here where he yelled, "You don't laugh at the misfortune of billionaires." Now that
you
was
laugh
funny.
when I tell you to.
Yeah,
he says after that.
Yeah,
there was also a great line where he says something about the whole thing with his having his face shoved in Rikishi's ass, and then he says something about like the crowd laughing as if this was some kind of cartoon you watch on television, and you sort of sit back and say, well, it is right now. So and then the other thing is at the end of this promo, Vince talks about he who laughs last laughs loudest, and that is a theme
is that a saying
into your skull.
Is that a real saying, or is that a Vince McMahon made up saying?
It was a Vince. I mean, it's a real saying, but it's a thing that
I've never heard anyone like say whoever
really?
laughs last laughs loudest.
Oh yeah, no, that's a
thing.
Phrase. Huh? That's a thing, but it was never more a thing in the history of mankind than it was for this 2 hours and 36 minutes on pay-per-view.
So when Flair came out, JR explained that Shane and Stephanie, they bought WCW and ECW. Flair and his consortium of investors came and bought out Shane and Stephanie's shares, and that's how he became 50% owner.
Yes, and so just think of this for a second. Jeremy just laid out the fact that we had the WCW invasion of the WWF. They do not shell out the money to bring in Ric Flair until after they end the feud between WCW and the WWF.
Yeah, unbelievable. That's why none of this works here. So basically, Flair says, let's start the show. And this 50-50 owner-partner split thing here was apparently the long-term idea was to eventually split the rosters into two groups, similar to what we saw with their Raw and SmackDown brand splits that would come years later. So that was kind of where this angle was leading. But Flair says, let's start the show, and the show begins the only way a show does, with a hot opener. Scotty 2 Hotty and Albert are a team, and
Hip Hop Hippo.
I literally have no memory of this. Yes, the Hip Hop Hippo is Albert's nickname. Now, I assume this is him bringing his gimmick from Japan over to the United States?
No, he had not been to Japan yet. So this was
okay.
he had been Albert, the A-Train, all that sort of stuff, and then he was, they didn't know what to do with an agile, intimidating 6'7" big man, so they made him into a jokey rapper hip hop hippo, teaming with Scotty 2 Hotty, who had obviously been part of the Too Cool team. Yeah. And they are taking on Test and Christian,
the WWE European Champion Christian.
Yes, I talk about a belt I had not thought of in a long time, or had almost completely forgotten about. But yes, the WWF European Champion. And really, to me, what can be said about this match is that it was not the Rockers versus the Orient Express at the Royal Rumble 91, no. I believe it was. Yeah. This was not the best tag team opener of a wrestling program you've ever seen in your life. But to me, the most noteworthy thing about this was that I had completely forgotten about Teddy Long being in the WWF as a referee. After so long, and he had started as a referee in WCW, and then was an announcer. He was a manager, managed Doom, managed many people. I had no recollection of him being a referee in the WWF whatsoever.
Test won something called an immunity battle royal, so that
What,
at the Survivor Series, so that he couldn't be fired for an entire year. So
what a bizarre stipulation. I mean, granted, it isn't if you're in the context of the WWF at that time, which everything was built around the megalomania of Vince McMahon's character and who was going to get fired this week, who was going to be forced to kiss his ass that week. But like looking back at it now, it's such a bizarre thing that you won a battle royal and then that meant you were immune from being fired, which then I guess meant that the other, I don't know, 19 men in the battle royal where it could be fired at any moment for any reason. Just weird.
yeah, no, and Test would come back later to sexually harass Trish Stratus just to show that he still can't be fired. So
Yeah, another the part of the family event.
good, it's good stuff. Um, we had we had dance moves, we had power moves.
A giant swing. That was awesome. That was, if there's anything I enjoyed in this match, it was the giant swing from Albert on Christian. And this was the beginning, by the way, of Jim Ross being so giddy that probably for the first and only time in his WWF career, he was going to be allowed to reference pro wrestling history throughout the show.
That's right.
He talked about this being a Don Leo Jonathan giant swing.
He gave
And this,
a Don Leo Jonathan reference by JR.
yes, it was weird throughout the show, and it was because it was the WWF half-heartedly trying to make this seem like the biggest unification match in the history of wrestling, but they had spent pretty much the entirety of the Vince McMahon Jr. era of the WWF minimizing and diminishing and ignoring anything outside of that company. And so there's just this weird cognitive dissonance, and then the fact that you're doing a unification of the WWF World Title and what was the WCW World Title until 1 month before you did the unification match. So anyway,
Scotty gets the worm on Test, which for those who don't remember is where he hops on one foot where the crowd chants WORM. He does the caterpillar and then finishes it with a chop. That's a finishing move, and people loved it. And then a Baldo bomb on Christian for the pin, and the Hip Hop Hippo gets the victory. What an opener.
This match existed.
Coachman's interviewing Regal in the back, and I was so thrilled to
immediate upgrade to the
get
proceedings.
More William Regal in my life. The line from Regal in the back that got me was, my methods aren't questions. My methods are successful, sunshine. And then he calls him a silly pillock and walks away. And I'm like, I love me some William Regal. What a guy.
He also had another great line where, for one, also he was a great heel in that he was talking down Edge, but also saying that he was a great athlete, which is great heel 101. You are going to be a jerk, but you also want the viewers at home to know that the person they're wrestling is a threat.
Yep.
And then he says, quote, he says, Edge is a great athlete, but, quote, he has incurred my wrath, and you'd be safer selling your soul to the devil than doing that.
Intercontinental Championship. Edge is the Intercontinental Champion, and he comes out with his theme song is Rob Zombie, Sinister Urge.
I have no recollection of that either. Like my only recollection of Rob Zombie as wrestling entrance music is watching ECW at 2 a.m.
Sure.
And hearing either him as entrance music or his music as like a cool video feature.
Yeah, not a bad theme song. That was fun.
No, it's fine.
Edge apparently unified the WCW US title and the Intercontinental title at the Survivor Series by defeating, obviously, Test. That's who you would defeat in a unification match.
Well, that's the other thing too, is throughout the show we get filled in on the history of like these unification matches with the championships, or
where no WCW guys were involved.
Yes, they talk about that when we get later into the show. They talk about like how we got here with the Rock having the big gold belt that used to be the WCW title until this show, and like it's basically like the last 3 title changes were all just WWF guy to WWF guy to WWF guy, and it's like, that's how they screwed this up. I remember clearly now.
So we had we had Regal on the outside. the crowd was going nuts, chanting "Regal sucks." Ton of heat for against Regal. I loved it. He has the best facials while he's hearing this chant. He's angry. He's upset. Love me some Regal. He's on the outside. He launches Edge back first into the ropes.
This was awesome.
So he hits his neck on the ropes and his back and then falls back down to the floor. I love that move. You don't see that almost ever.
No, I had honestly, unless I have seen it and can't remember, I don't think I've ever seen that before other than here from Regal. And I watched this show live. I don't have any recollection of that. But no, Regal was brilliant, just like he always is. He was also, to me, he was in the best shape I've ever seen him in his career. Like, he was, by William Regal standards, the man was jacked.
Absolutely. The big move of the match, Edge gave Regal a top rope Huracan, which was super impressive. And you don't expect Regal to be taking that off the top. Edge going for a spear off the apron. Regal moves. He ends up spearing the steps. And that's when Regal has a chance to get the brass knucks that he hid between the ring apron and the ring post.
By the way, that was referenced earlier on. This was sort of foreshadowed, I should say, when the referee was checking Regal very closely before the match started, checking him for brass knucks. And JR informed us that he had been caught using brass knucks several times recently. So that was sort of something hanging out there going into this match.
Yeah, as he pulls out the brass knuckles from his hidden location there, JR goes, "He'd be hellacious at Easter egg time." Like, well done. And Regal ends up, he hit 2 double underhooks into power bombs.
That was awesome. That was something I don't recall seeing a lot of from Regal as well. And I guess it's interesting to note, too, if you listen to the show that we did covering WCW World War III and we talk about Regal, he definitely had to change his style a little bit when he came to WWF. Like, we do see a few cool, mat things, a few counters, but given the fact that WWF had a much more homogenous style and does to this day, that you had to fit in a lot more, and a lot of the more interesting aspects of what guys did were sort of funneled out. Regal, you see him here using more high impact offense than you would have seen him use before.
Yeah, and that was actually, he hit him back to back. That was his third power bomb of the match. Still couldn't beat Edge. So Regal, frustrated, puts on the brass knucks. But Edge spear out of nowhere, 3 count. Edge is still your Intercontinental Champion.
This was a very good match. The finish was a little bit out of nowhere, like you said, in that Edge had very little offense until the finish. But I enjoyed it. It's, again, when you're watching these shows, particularly WWF shows in general, but around this time period, you kind of have to get yourself in the right mental space to process what's happening, in that you're not going to see, for the most part, a lot of mat wrestling. This one had a little bit more than you normally would this match, but it really is going to be just trading moves, working to a finish. A lot of times you're not going to have a clean finish. And it's noteworthy too, when you go back to some of the shows that we've reviewed so far on this program, the WWF fan, they did not react to new things they hadn't seen before, whether that be wrestlers or moves or counters. They were there to see the stars and to see the things that those guys did that they knew were coming. Obviously something like the worm or the people's elbow being the most obvious example, but even just the guys' movesets were much more static. And when guys did different things, it didn't get a lot of reaction as it would in other companies.
Flair in the back talking to Kurt Angle. Angle says he's going to win and unify the title, and Flair agrees. And he literally, they're going back and forth. He's like, "I'm going to do it."
Great.
And Flair's like, I agree. And he said, "That's awesome." And I laughed.
Flair was great in these. I hate hidden camera backstage segments, but Flair was great in these. And Kurt Angle
he just kept saying, "That's awesome."
Kurt Angle, to me, and again, I remember watching back in this time period, and Kurt Angle and just he was great in the ring, but also just his comedic timing and just him as a character back then. He was one of the few things that kept me coming back every week and enjoying the shows. Like, he's
fantastic.
Fantastic.
Lita is shown wearing a skimpy ref shirt and a zebra thong. And Matt Hardy joins her, and Lita says, "Even though you're my boyfriend, I'm going to call it down the middle." For a match where we've got Hardy versus Hardy, Matt versus Jeff, brother versus brother. We had an awesome video package.
Yes.
Showing home movies, their debut match, ladder match highlights. We get voiceovers about how much they love and respect each other. And then apparently the problems started in a cage match when instead of climbing out of the cage, Jeff went off the top with a swanton, missed, crashed through the table, and then Matt starts questioning Jeff's selfishness, and it was this started the problems with the team. All you care about is yourself. Matt ended up picking Lita to be the referee for this match, and here we go. It was time.
He also has, by the way, Matt has a classic line where he says to Lita, "If you love me, you'll take my side," during the argument. We also had, you didn't do justice to just how cringy and stilted the line was when Lita was talking about being the ref. This was before the video package ran. I believe the quote, as I have it written down, is exactly, "As your girlfriend, I am always on your side, but my job tonight is to be a WWF official and call it down the middle."
Yeah, it's one of those lines that nobody would speak this way. Yeah.
Exactly. And then we have it was a bit cheesy, but actually a pretty great line from Lawler, where he says, "Brother against brother, oh brother."
So Matt and Jeff come out, and they both come out to the same theme song. Like, the song just keeps playing while both men are introduced. I didn't care for that. So Jeff comes out, and he's wrestling in a baseball cap.
Yeah, he comes out with a baseball hat, and you're thinking, okay, he has a baseball hat. He's going to throw it in the crowd. It's
right.
like Bret Hart putting the sunglasses on. Nope, this is a part of the man's ring gear, not his entrance gear, his ring gear for
this serious bout, brother versus brother. I'm going to wear a baseball cap while I'm doing it. Okay. And the crowd was really quiet, didn't know what to do. It
was even a reference by Lawler. Lawler's like, the crowd doesn't know whether to cheer or boo, or JR says it. Yep. And yeah, because this nobody, you can do brother versus brother feuds if it's built perfectly, and if the crowd wants to see it. This was way too early on in the run of Matt and Jeff Hardy, and they were way too beloved. Nobody wanted to see these two guys at odds.
No, nobody was ready for Matt to be a heel at this point. He hadn't done enough to where they really wanted to boo him. And yeah, and Jeff was, Jeff was just starting to get on the rise. So,
and this would have been in like 1986 if you decided, hey, a good idea would be to break up Ricky Morton and Robert Gibson. Let's do that.
Yeah, so there was a lot of Matt wrestling early. We had Lita trying to call it down the middle, even catching Matt using the ropes at one point and breaking that up. We had a big move where Matt goes for a sunset flip bomb to the floor, but Jeff counters with a Rana, and it looked like he may have hit his head on the floor while giving it. Yes. I screamed at my TV when I saw that, but apparently he was okay enough to continue on. We had Jeff selling his leg most of the match, selling his knee, and limping to the top rope. Matt catches him, slams him off the top. These were just some of the big moves of the match, because the rest of it was pretty undescript.
It was nondescript. It was pretty dry, which, again, if you're doing a brother versus brother match and you're trying to, I think part of the problem too is it fell somewhat in between. They had this match, they had like a half falling out, and they were not getting along, but they didn't full on hate each other. And then the match was kind of caught in between too. They were doing a pro wrestling match, but then there's a little bit of, as the match went on, healing it up. But it was, like we said, it didn't need to happen. Nobody was ready for it. And then when they did it, they didn't really pull the trigger. It almost felt like as they were working through this storyline, they could feel or knew, and by that I just mean the company, that this wasn't what they should be doing, but they had already gone forward with doing it. They had already dedicated several weeks of TV to it. So it's like, okay, we've got to carry this out to whatever conclusion it's going to be. But it didn't feel to me like anybody's heart was in it, whether it be the Hardys, the company.
Yeah.
This should, something like this, when you have a team that is as big of a deal as they were and their brothers, the last thing it should ever feel like is a word that I've used a few times on the show, perfunctory, or just it shouldn't feel like it's just there. And that's what this was.
So finish comes with a twist of fate off the top that gets countered, and Matt's down, Swanton, Jeff's on top, Lita's counting, and Matt puts his foot on the bottom rope at 1, but Jeff pulls it off, and Lita counts 3. Jeff wins, but with controversy, and with all the TV building this up, as we saw in that awesome video package, expectations were too high, and it just didn't deliver close to those expectations.
No, not as a match, and also not in terms of progressing the story. I think people, well, it was still early on. I think when you're having them wrestle for the first time, you're expecting something conclusive, and instead, this felt more like a Raw segment than a pay-per-view match.
Trish and Rock are backstage, and she wishes him luck with a kiss on the cheek, and they flirt and fun with Trish and Rock.
Yes, exactly. They're definitely there are far worse characters you could have doing what they did here backstage for a minute than these two. That's for sure.
Tag Team Championship. We have the undisputed tag team champions, the Dudley Boys, with Stacy Keibler, which I don't remember Stacy Keibler managing the Dudley Boys. But
I have zero recollection of that until, I still honestly don't. And again, I watched the show and was watching the product at the time.
Yeah, so was I.
There was not really any explanation either as to why she was with them. So that was strange. And they were taking on the team of The Big Show and Kane for the unified, I guess, tag team championship.
Yes, the tag team championships were unified, and here we go. It was impressive watching the Big Show move around, because he
could move here. He
still had agility, good knees. He was moving,
and he still had the agility, but he had gotten bigger. Granted, he was not as big as they said. The worked weights that they gave out on this show were absurd. They said, and I quote, "The Big Show was 7'2" and over 500 pounds." That was not in fact true.
No. So the Dudleys were thrown to the outside. Big move with Kane on the top rope. He dives off the top onto the Dudleys to the floor. That was a big move. And with everybody wiped out, Stacy Keibler is in the ring for no reason whatsoever.
Yeah, this whole thing was just...
There's no reason. I'm like,
she just appeared.
She's in the ring, and then the Big Show pulls down her skirt from behind, bends her over his knee, and smacks her on the ass. Classy stuff.
Yeah, this match, I watched it, and I could not fathom why anybody would be finding the Big Show and Kane to be the faces in the match. Because there were multiple times where, for no reason at all, they attacked Stacy Keibler.
Attacking Stacy Keibler, I know.
And there was also, I assume, if there was a reason for which they were doing that, JR would have brought it up. Like, there wasn't
Nobody told
she had
us. No, there was no videos.
She hadn't cost them anything. It was just they hated women, apparently, which was not, that kind of was a theme running through the presentation of the product at that time. But also, if you can imagine this spot and imagine how annoying Jerry Lawler must have been during this spot, you are not even close to how annoying he actually was during this spot. It was just, yeah.
No, and it'll get worse. And and so a few miscues between Big Show and Kane, and Big Show hits Kane. He turns around. He's grabbing Stacy again, attacking her for no reason, unprovoked.
For no reason, pulls her from the outside in, or tries to pull her from the outside in for no reason. She's literally just standing there, and he's like, "I, as a good and moral man, am going to grab this woman and attempt to attack her." What?
while this is happening, the turnbuckle pad gets removed by Bubba, and the Dudleys pick up the Big Show, drop him face first into the exposed buckle for the 3 count.
JR calls it a 3D, even though it's a double team like flapjack, which is odd. I will say the 2 things I enjoyed most about this match: 1, the arm wringer executed by the Big Show here, and the Midnight Express reference made by Jim Ross, as again, he was allowed to talk about the things in his past in the pro wrestling history that he loved for one night only.
In the back, Lita tells Matt that she didn't see his foot. Matt leaves in a huff. This story must continue. So we've got a match for the Hardcore Championship. They announced that this match is for the Hardcore Championship, and then the Undertaker comes out, and I'm like, the Undertaker is challenging for the Hardcore Championship? Okay.
Well, yeah, because if you remember at this time, and I'm not saying this more for the benefit of the listeners, because I know you do, Jeremy, and that's why you reacted this way. The Hardcore title was an absolute joke. Like that, it was literally a running joke on the show. It was, there was no prestige to it at all. But here, Rob Van Dam was the Hardcore champion. In some ways, that appeared to be maybe the start of them doing something with it that wasn't quite a joke. Also allowing Rob Van Dam to be able to do more of the ECW style stuff in his matches, which, Van Daminators, Van Terminators, random things with chairs don't necessarily fit in a regular WWF match. But yeah, I was not expecting a competitive match between 2 major stars for the Hardcore Championship on this show.
No, and the Undertaker is in full biker gimmick at this point.
Yes.
We've got a video package recapping that the Undertaker went heel because he beat up Jim Ross, and he forced Jim Ross to kiss McMahon's bare ass. So Taker's a bad guy.
He wants respect. That's the whole thing. He's the conscience of the WWF, and he wants respect. It was bizarre to me because, and I guess it was part of his character was like delusional at this point, but the idea that the Undertaker didn't have respect was strange, but I guess that was the point.
Yes, he just wants respect, and he's mocking RVD, and so we keep rolling with Limp Bizkit as the Undertaker comes out on his motorcycle
with a short haircut, a crew cut for the Undertaker.
Yeah, keep rolling, Limp Bizkit. Fun fact, I was at WrestleMania in Seattle where Limp Bizkit performed live for the Undertaker.
Wow,
that
a
year,
moment in time right there.
Yeah, so we had lots of RVD chants. He had
awesome knockoff music
popular.
Of his ECW theme, by the way. Like usually, it really, to me, it seemed much more like something WCW do, where they would have the just slightly off-key version of like a Nirvana song or a Pearl Jam song as somebody's entrance music. They actually did a good job here with their knockoff RVD music.
It absolutely was, and and he was very popular. People loved Rob Van Dam, and he got in a lot of offense early. And he was using quickness to avoid Undertaker punches, countering with kicks. And he RVD leaping to the top rope, and he ends up hitting a somersault dive onto Undertaker. And I'm like, oh, I forgot. I haven't watched an RVD match in a long time, and just watching how how agile he was in being able to jump to the top rope, and yeah, absolutely.
He was not the greatest catch-as-catch-can wrestler you ever see, but in his prime, he was incredibly athletic and one of the most, just visually impressive wrestlers. I can vividly remember going to ECW shows just a couple years before, and he was doing stuff that nobody else was doing, and he was just a completely unique presentation and a character that, even though WWF didn't really quite get it, the crowd did. And like you said, he was very much over with these fans, again in a match with the Undertaker, and it was at least 50-50.
Absolutely. And RVD clotheslines Taker over the rail, and they're into the crowd, fighting amongst the crowd. RVD jumps onto the hockey boards that that are around the lower bowl of the arena and hits Taker with a moonsault. Still in the crowd. Very impressive.
Yes, that was awesome. That was also, it was the San Diego Gulls hockey
That
team.
it is.
Gulls, as a bit of a play on words, was the minor league hockey team here. We also had a spot where RVD grabbed a Mexican flag from a fan right over by the hockey boards and choked Rob Van Dam with it. And then after the moonsault, we have a spot where Taker gets control back and throws RVD into the guardrail, and it almost completely obliterates this middle-aged woman who is working security. Just like maybe the most terrifying thing that happened on this show.
Right after that moment, the crowd's chanting RVD at Taker. RVD, RVD. And he turns around, yells at the crowd, RVD's getting his ass kicked.
That was great. I was never a huge Undertaker guy. I will fully admit, while I did not identify with any of the music that was associated with Biker Taker, and I certainly was not a biker, that is by far my favorite era of the Undertaker in terms of in-ring and just
his attitude, his promos.
His promos, his dismissiveness. Like, it was, I loved it. I wish we would have gotten much more of that in his career. I greatly enjoyed the Undertaker on this evening.
Taker had a steel chair. RVD had a fire extinguisher spraying Taker, and we're in full hardcore mode here in the back, off to the side of the stage area. Rob Van Dam ends up going up the stairs, and he's standing on top of the doorway to that side stage area. So this would be where like a Zamboni would enter from.
Yeah, it's probably a good 15 feet up, I would say.
Yeah, and he gives the RVD thumbs to the shoulder there, and then does his crossbody all the way to Taker on the floor. And it looked like Taker falls onto padding or a mat. There was some dust and smoke coming off of it.
Huge pile of dust.
And everybody's dusty and dirty now. But
it's so weird. Like, why was that area dusty? This is like a Chinese sports arena. This was not like way in the back of the building. This was out within public view, and they just landed on like the dirtiest spot in all of San Diego.
Yeah, so I assume this was to cover up so you didn't you would be distracted by a mat of some kind out there. But
yeah.
Van Dam ends up going for a pin behind the Titantron area there. They end up brawling out on the stage. Taker puts Van Dam across his shoulder and arms and rams him head first into the metal stage decorations. It was a great sound. It was great visual on the impact. Awesome.
This was think Kevin Nash, Rey Mysterio lawn dart on Nitro, but into an even more unforgiving metal object.
Taker gives a sign like he's going to give him the last ride. Powerbomb gets him up into position. RVD grabs that same stage decoration that his head just went into moments ago, and he holds on, kicks his way free. We got to see Van Dam do a somersault onto the stage into a senton.
Rolling Thunder.
Which JR tells us is the Rolling Thunder.
Absolutely. And we had RVD get really going offense here. We had an awesome baseball slide drop kick. He had Undertaker sort of up against the staging and hit him with a baseball slide drop kick with the chair. But then he goes for, after that, the Van Daminator.
It was still very safe, and Undertaker was protecting himself. And,
yes.
And you've never seen RVD trying so hard not to stiff a guy. I mean, he'd been known for, with his kicks, to land a few stiff ones in there, but he was trying very hard to work very light with Taker, and it still looked good. They had definitely a good back and forth here.
He took a different approach when chairs were involved with Undertaker than, say, Balls Mahoney.
Correct. And then we had Taker teasing a tombstone on a chair on the stage, but Van Dam slips behind, hits his kick. Taker's teetering atop the stage, but then he's able to choke slam RVD off the stage. He goes through 2 tables to the floor. He goes down and pins him. Holy crap. Undertaker's the hardcore champion. This title reign, I was surprised he was even in this match. I have no idea he had a title reign after it. Hardcore champion, new hardcore champion, The Undertaker.
Yeah, and they did a great job. For one, the finish was brutal. That choke slam off the stage through two tables. If there was a crash pad, it was more table than crash pad that he caught.
Oh, 100, yeah, 100%, yeah.
The match was, for what it was for that type of match, it was awesome. I thoroughly enjoyed this, and
this match was so fun. And I'm not a big hardcore wrestling fan,
no,
but like I'm a big RVD fan, and I really enjoyed Undertaker's performance as well. Yeah, I really enjoyed this match.
And the thing the announcers did very well was sort of selling the fact that, oh my God, the Undertaker is the hardcore champion. What does this mean for the rest of the WWE that now, or the WWF, that the Undertaker now can basically compete with no rules? Then he rides out on his big Harley Davidson as Jim Ross gets in his classic nickname that nobody else other than Jim Ross likes for the Undertaker of Booger Red.
Yeah, that's a terrible nickname.
I had completely forgotten about that, and I wish I had said it that way, but that was not the case here. We did then go backstage to two great men in another one of these hidden camera segments, but it was Ric Flair and Chris Jericho talking to each other, and it was as good as you would expect Ric Flair and Chris Jericho talking to each other backstage.
I love it. I wanted more of it. And
yes.
We had Jericho explaining he'd beaten The Rock twice. Tonight he's going to beat him a third time. Then he's going to beat Angle or Austin. All good stuff.
Yes. Then that takes us to a match that really isn't a whole lot to say about the match itself, but it is a time capsule. It is Trish Stratus versus Jackie for the women's championship. And if you want to look back at how different women's wrestling was treated compared to modern day, just watch this match and listen to the announcing. For one, Jerry Lawler it is beyond embarrassing and infuriating him throughout this match. And then the crowd,
we want puppies chant right from the start.
Immediately. And then just I mean, you would just have to watch everything that Jerry Lawler says. I'm not going to repeat it. Just completely ridiculous. And again, I have not gone back and watched pretty much anything from this era of WWF in a long time. And I was completely taken aback by this segment.
There's a match going on, and all I'm hearing is Lawler talking about Trish is wearing a black bra repeatedly over and over and over again.
Yes. And that was the least offensive thing that he said in these 3.5 minutes.
Yeah,
that gives you an idea of how bad that was.
So annoying. It was sloppy and slow at first. There was a weird spot where Trish almost landed. She landed hard and awkward on her head during the leg sweep.
Yes.
Trish ends up winning with a backslide out of nowhere. That was weird. At least it was short. And Trish is still the women's champion. We move on. They
tell us again, if we didn't remember, by the way, that tonight, he who laughs last will laugh loudest.
That's right.
And then we get a long video feature recapping everything that happened with Vince and The Rock and Rikishi, which we really didn't need because Vince already told us, and this is a pay-per-view that we paid money to see.
Vince told us, The Rock told us. We didn't need to see it. We've been told. You can tell us or you can show us. I hate when you do both. Yeah,
especially with something this bad.
So bad.
Three strikes for sure.
Yes, the Vince McMahon. The good news is the Vince McMahon Kiss My Ass Club was finally closed. Thank God.
Yeah.
And
so
now
then we go back to WWF New York because we need to hear from Rikishi because we need a little bit more analysis of this angle.
Ugh. Finally, we're to the point where we've got championships to unify here for the first time.
God.
And we've got the first match will be Stone Cold Steve Austin, the WWF champion, defending against the challenger Kurt Angle. And like you mentioned, JR was mentioning history. We got a Gotch Hackenschmidt reference from JR
absolutely.
at the beginning of this match.
We also had Lou Thez reference at the beginning of this match. Lawler talking about being the AWA champion and saying, quote, we tried to unify it back. I don't know if he actually said 88. I think he might have said 1988, but it didn't work. We had Jim Ross finally in his element on the show, getting to call something that was closely somewhat adjacent to sports, talking about how the key to this match for Austin was going to be avoiding the suplexes and ankle locks. of Kurt Angle. And again, this was awesome because we had Howard Finkel doing the introductions, but because it was the WWF and they were so neurotic and so weird about like age of anyone that wasn't a McMahon, that we never got to see Howard Finkel. We just heard him. He was just he might have been home for all we know, piping the voice into the show.
They start out trading punches, and man, both Austin and Angle throw great punches.
Yes.
It was so good. And JR reminds us that Austin is the only competitor of the four guys tonight to never hold the WCW title. That
Absolutely.
is how bad this invasion was. Austin actually worked for WCW. He was the only competitor not to ever hold the WCW title.
Yes, and he absolutely, as an aside that I won't get into, he absolutely should have held the WCW world title. And again, other people have talked about it. We won't go into it, but the fact that they let him slip through their hands and he ended up here was something else. But anyway.
Angle does this awesome roll through, picks the ankle into the ankle lock so smooth. Austin gets the ropes. We've got a big backdrop. Angle gets dumped over the top to the floor.
And nobody took a better bump to the floor, by the way, an over the top rope bump to the floor than Kurt Angle, because it looked like in full speed, it looks completely crazy and dangerous. But when you actually look at it, it's completely safe.
Yeah.
He was a master. And again, he was still pretty darn early in his career at this point, which is even crazy.
It's amazing how good he was for where he was in his career. We've got Angle slapping a figure four on around the ring post on Austin.
And giving himself a concussion. That spot, it's an amazing, very cool spot, but it is almost impossible to not crack the back of your head, basically power bombing yourself on the mat as you lock the figure four on and then lean back for full effect. I remember Bret Hart several times inadvertently doing quite a bit of damage to himself with that move.
We've got a belly-to-belly overhead suplex by Angle. We've got Austin trying to brawl his way free, but Angle sends him sternum first into the buckles, follows it up with 3 German suplexes. That sets it up so that Angle can go for his awesome moonsault.
Beautiful. Like, honestly, I mean, there's so many different types of moonsaults. There's the Great Muta, which is, where it's just the snap and the torque.
Impact, yep.
But Kurt Angle, you've never seen a more beautiful, graceful, high moonsault than he would do. He almost never hit it, but I don't even care. It was just an absolute thing of beauty. Again, from a guy who was relatively early in his career, not a high flyer otherwise, just an incredible, obviously world-class athlete.
Literally like floating in the air, feeling like slow motion. It was, just spectacular.
Like his moonsault looked like if you made an NBA Jam version of a wrestling game and gave somebody like a really ridiculous moonsault where they sort of like floated so high that they like left Earth and then came back down and landed on the mat. This looked like that in real life.
Austin hits Angle with 5 German suplexes. And to your point again about JR being awesome, JR points out that Angle instinctively always rolls to his stomach.
Yes, as an amateur wrestler, that is the thing that you always make sure your back is not on the mat.
And he made sure to point out that even after those 5 Germans, he did that. Angle hits the Angle slam, but Austin's able to kick out. Angle goes for a stunner on Austin. It gets countered. Austin with the stunner. He gets the pin. The match was good, but these two have had better matches together.
Yes.
So, definitely not one of their best together, but definitely a good match all around.
Oh, yeah. On this show, it definitely stood out, and they had great chemistry. They would go on. They had better matches before. They would go on to have better matches. But, yeah, it was highly enjoyable. It was a little short. The finish was a little bit flat, but again, they were going, the winner of this was going to have to wrestle later. I was just thankful that we got a legit finish out of it.
Yes.
The other thing that I thought was noteworthy, and maybe I just haven't gone back and watched a ton of Austin from this time period in a while, but I do not recall him ever using as many chops as he used on this evening.
A lot of chops, yeah.
They were laying into each other with knife-edge chops, but particularly Austin. Austin, I always remember more as a guy that threw those awesome sidearm punches, kicks to the stomachs, the occasional knee to the stomach, but not a lot of chops. That was on display quite a bit here.
We cut to the back where Test busts into Trish's dressing room to flex his immunity status by sexually harassing her. He wanted to give her a congratulations kiss and, quote, "Once you've had Test, you can forget about the rest."
This came off about as charismatic as you would expect it to.
Calls her a tease. Trish throws him out. And now we're ready for the WCW champion, The Rock.
The not WCW champion, because again...
It is billed as the World Championship, right?
And they talk about, JR actually says, like, this is the culmination, even though the angle fizzled. This show and this not a tournament. This is the culmination of everything with WCW and WWF. And the idea is that this is the one undisputed world champion. Even though they don't call it the WCW title, that's the idea. They actually say that last month, the name of the belt was changed from the WCW world title to the world title. Why? Why would you not keep that, call the WCW world title for one more month? If you're trying to push this as the big unification. Finally, we have one world champion. They show all this footage throughout the show in the open and reference all throughout the show of guys that were WCW world champion, guys that were NWA world champion. You've got Jim Ross talking about wrestling history from all over the wrestling world. But we can't call it the WCW world title to blow off the WWF versus WCW feud. Just baffling.
I mentioned it at the top of this show. Too many title changes. And we're recapped that The Rock won the WCW title at SummerSlam, lost it to Jericho at No Mercy, then won it back a few weeks later. Okay.
Yeah. What was that? That was.
And now I'm caught up on when Jericho won the WCW title to make Austin be the only man in this four that hadn't held the WCW title. Because I was also trying to remember when that happened, and that happened apparently at No Mercy. So we're all caught up now. And The Rock was in control early with leapfrogs and punches.
Ricky Steamboat arm drags from The Rock. That was awesome.
He is so popular. People are going nuts for The Rock. They love this guy.
Well, they are. But we do have early on after those arm drags, we have a light Rocky sucks chant, and there are Y2J chants that are not insignificant. I thought that was interesting.
He hits a the Rock is on the apron. Jericho's able to hit a springboard drop kick, and we're back in the ring with Jericho hitting a back elbow off the top rope.
An early Judas effect.
That's right.
A super Judas effect 20 years earlier.
And we even got the Jericho foot on the chest flexing pin attempt. Definitely
the come on baby pin.
One
Absolutely.
of my favorites.
Which started off as a babyface thing when he was a white bread babyface in Japan and ECW and in WCW, and then that morphed into a great cocky heel thing. We were also told early on in this match, Jeremy, that Chris Jericho had beaten The Rock twice. That was hammered into our heads throughout the show and throughout this match.
That's right. We had we also had where Jericho's hitting Rock with a belly to back suplex, and Rock holds the back of his head every time he takes this move. And I remember that I never used to like it, but now I do. And
yes,
I like
perspective changes.
Well, and I like that, as a reality to the match, he's trying to protect his head on a fall.
Yeah.
And I'm like, okay, no, I like it. So I've come around on that.
It's the same sort of thing. Like I remember as a kid who is like, oh man, chair shots, that's awesome. And would be like, oh, that chair shot sucked because the guy put his hands up. Well, A, I'm glad he put his hands up because I don't want him to actually die. And B, if a man is swinging a chair at you and you're not already unconscious, the natural human reaction is going to be put your hands up and try to block the impact. So yeah, totally fine with that. Looking back through 2020 eyes.
A long sleeper hold Jericho has on The Rock. The Rock's able to punch his way free. And how awesome were these punches? I thought they were awesome. Fantastic.
And also the thing that I noted is that both The Rock and Kurt Angle pretty much throw the exact same punches, and those punches are exactly the same as what Scott Hall / Razor Ramon would throw for his punches. Where you throw this, there's a ton of impact, and at the last second you open up the hand, so it's more of a slap, even though it's supposed to be a punch, but the delivery is almost exactly the same.
Jericho hits a lion salt, and The Rock was far away, but he still
Yes.
hit it perfectly. Awesome performance from Jericho there. We had the superplex where it gets countered. Jericho off the top hits a crossbody. The Rock rolls through, hooks the legs, and only gets a 2 count. But the place was on their feet for that near fall,
Well,
and
that was
they
a
bought it.
long 2 count. That was a perfectly executed by all three men, the two wrestlers and the referee here.
Oh, so good. Jericho comes flying into the corner. The Rock sidesteps him. Jericho hits the top of the post and goes over the top all the way to the floor. Doesn't hit the apron, just hits the post and then hits the floor. Ouch. That was brutal. We've got them both fighting on the outside, which results in Jericho hitting a catapult, sending The Rock into the post. This was the first not great thing in the match. I thought that looked awfully silly. And, it's wrestling physics and all, but still, there was The Rock lunging to the post. Didn't care for that.
This also started it started to go into what every main event or co-main event match in WWF it felt like for like a 10-year period went, which is, you'd have some brawling, you'd have, some even stuff in the ring, they'd go out to the floor, and then the match was centered around the Spanish announce table. Like this, I really enjoyed the early part of this match. I enjoyed a lot of the work in it, but it did start to feel a little bit like WWF main event early 2000s paint by numbers when we got to this point.
Well, they're instead of the Spanish announce table, they are on Jerry Lawler and JR's table. They've cleared it off.
That's true, yeah.
And Jericho is teasing a rock bottom. The Rock's able to counter into a DDT through the table, and at this point, I did have to check to make sure the Spanish announce table was still intact, and it was. JR and King's table is destroyed.
Jim Ross was stuck too when they started going towards this table. Like Lawler got far enough away, and then they're both on the table. Like Jericho's going for the rock bottom, and Ross is right there. He's got his headset. He can't get it off. He still is trying to call it, but he can't get away. So he is in the middle of the action here.
Back in the ring, Jericho's going for a people's elbow. And instead of throwing off the elbow pad into the crowd like The Rock does, he drops it in the ring and flips off the crowd. Great stuff.
It was great. He got a great reaction too. This was pretty young Chris Jericho, and only a couple years into. Well, I mean, he had been, I guess, in WCW a full-fledged heel too, but he is every bit the heel back then that he is. Yeah. Yes, absolutely.
The Rock ends up countering that people's elbow into a sharpshooter. Jericho reverses to his own sharpshooter.
Oof. And this was on the again, if you've listened to episodes of this show before, this wasn't
Diesel British Bulldogs episode 1 in your house level of terrible.
Yeah, this wasn't quite a Davey Boy Smith sharpshooter on that fateful night in 1995, but it wasn't that far off. It's what you see a lot when men who don't do a sharpshooter often try to do it. I remember in a Vader Sting match, which was otherwise great because all Vader Sting matches were great. Remember Big Van Vader of all people doing a really bad sharpshooter where you see this a lot where guys, they put it on and then they turn the man over, they have the legs in position, and then they just kind of stand there and don't like lean back or sit down at all. So you're watching, and other than maybe mild discomfort on the ankles, you really can't see how the man would be in any pain at all. And it was kind of bad because Jericho had it on and it was not really cinched in at all, but you had Rock, selling it like death, trying to get to the ropes.
Well, yeah, because this
was
and
JR selling it like death too.
Yeah, because this was the big turning point here where Rock is about to pass out from the pain, comes to, is able to get the ropes, and then he's able to hit Jericho with a rock bottom, but he can't make the cover because he's taken so much punishment. Out comes Vince McMahon running down. I could hear you screaming from your apartment, Adam, watching this at a different time than me. I could hear you yelling as Vince McMahon runs down. He distracts the
referee. Because this wasn't a terrible match at this point. Like, I was enjoying the match.
Yeah.
I was enjoying seeing the novelty of young Chris Jericho and The Rock together. I had
I
not. I mean,
was having a great
obviously
time.
Jericho when he first came into WWF, The Rock was his target. But like, I didn't have a whole lot of recollection of the two of them in the ring together. So I was interested as we watched the show to see how they meshed, and I was like, oh, this is really fun. And then, yes, what happened happened.
Vince is distracting the ref. Rock goes to cover. No one's there to count. So Rock punches Vince off the apron. Spine buster, people's elbow. Vince is back on the apron again. So Rock brings him in the ring, throwing him over the top rope into the ring. He ends up hitting the elbow on Jericho. And then he's right back to punching Vince in the corner when Jericho hits a low blow on the Rock and follows it up with a rock bottom on. So Jericho hits the Rock with his own move, hits him with the rock bottom, gets the pin. Chris Jericho's the new world's champion, or now two-time WCW champion.
And as much as I hated the interference and the wackiness of it, it was done very well. And I love the fact that Jericho hit him with the rock bottom and pinned him. He pinned him with his own move. We see that almost as a trope now in modern wrestling where, the match will get, really deep into it. Guys are going back and forth. That's great. And then one guy will hit the other guy with his finisher, the opposite guy's finisher, and not get the pin. Like that never ends the match. So I didn't remember that. And I was actually pleasantly surprised that the Jericho rock bottom ended the match here.
No time to celebrate. As soon as he holds up the belt from his knees, the glass hits, and here comes Steve Austin.
And we had a great look of shock from Chris Jericho here.
Great
but I will say,
Jericho.
Austin comes down, and it's weird. He comes down to the ring, and he immediately goes toward Jericho in the corner, but it's kind of awkward and tentative. Like they were, I think, because then what ends up happening is... Austin tells Hebner to ring the bell, but it hasn't rung yet, and that plays into the story. Angle comes in, wassels with the chair. You'll get into all that, but it felt like they were buying time for Angle to get out. Like they were expecting Angle to be there earlier. It felt weird because we had this rushed thing of the last match ending. Austin comes down, and then it felt a little off.
No, you mentioned it. Angle immediately runs in, hits Austin with a chair. The Rock is back in. He hits the rock bottom on Jericho. Both men are down. The Rock chases out Kurt Angle, and the
match hasn't started yet.
No, the bell finally rings.
I will say that it was kind of a creative way to get the match basically to the point of starting at would be the finishing stretch. You had these two things happen, and then now the match is going to start. Both guys are getting up from a 10 count. I will say it was odd that the ref was doing a double count here because we were told that there would be an undisputed champion. There had to be a winner. There would only be one champion. What happens if he counts both men down?
I literally wrote the same thing down. I'm like, why are you counting? Why?
And then at the same time, there was also like the crowd was distracted by something. I don't know what, but they were looking towards the entranceway. So that was a little bit weird. And one other thing I want to mention, I don't want it to get lost as we go through this. There was throughout this match a lot of the two men talking to each other, calling spots. Like this match, other than, the finish, this whole match was called in the ring, which was it was very interesting to see and hear how loudly you could hear each of them telling each other, what was coming next.
Yeah, we're told this is their first one-on-one match. Could that be true?
Yeah.
I was surprised.
It tracks because, unless they had wrestled on house shows, because by the time Jericho came in, Austin was long gone in WCW, and then they weren't programmed together at all when Jericho came to WWF in '99. So like that was an interesting curiosity of this too, was to see how these two guys, particularly because Austin was obviously Stone Cold Steve Austin, and then Jericho he had been in the WWF for several years at that point, but he still had a lot of his WCW tendencies as far as how he wrestled in the ring. So it was an interesting mix.
And you've got Austin going for the stunner. Jericho immediately retreats to the outside. Austin posts Jericho and pulls back the mats on the outside, exposing the concrete. Jericho hits a right hand, and Austin goes down, and he hits his head on the concrete. It was brutal.
Brutal and nasty, and like taking that bump on unexposed concrete for a punch was, yeah, I was not enthused to see that. That made me angry.
Jericho puts Austin on the Spanish announce table, and Jericho blocks a stunner, tries to put on the walls of Jericho.
Because that will hurt more on an announce table.
On an announce table. But that's countered as Austin uses leg strength to throw Jericho off the table. Austin then goes to suplex him on the exposed concrete floor. Inside,
this is, by the way, where I noticed a lot of talking to each other, a lot of calling the match on the fly, which is fine. I don't mind it, but it was just noticeable, particularly in this era of WWF, to hear that clearly.
Back inside the ring, Austin goes shoulder first into the post, and Jericho rolls out of a kick out into an armbar.
This was awesome. Into the Fujiwara armbar.
And then he's pushing on the ropes for extra leverage on the armbar. I thought that was so cool, so smooth.
And it was different. Usually whenever you see a guy doing a submission or going for a pin and they put their feet on the ropes, their stomach first, and they're putting their feet on the second rope, and it's, you know, the front of their shins or their feet. This, he had the Fujiwara armbar on, so he's more back to the mat than stomach to the mat, and sort of sits back and puts his feet up on the second rope. And to me, that also, it was a much more believable thing of like, wow, that's a lot of added leverage, and that is going to rip that man's shoulder out of his socket. And that's another one of those things, as we've talked about on different episodes of this show, and even on this one of this podcast, that I don't recall seeing anyone else do that before or since.
No, and we get a quote where JR says, Austin holding his arm close to his side is a sure sign there's an injury there.
Great JR.
Great JR right there. Jericho gets the walls on, and Austin, he's got the walls of Jericho on. Austin ends up back up. He ducks Jericho, who knocks the ref out inadvertently.
Earl Hebner, by the way, the referee for this match at this point.
So Jericho immediately with another low blow, and this time he hits a stunner after. So playing off the finish of the last match where he low blowed and hit the Rock with the rock bottom for the win, he hits a stunner on Austin. Vince is out again, waving for another referee, and it's Nick Patrick.
WCW senior official Nick Patrick, who
he's a crooked official now.
Yes, well, he had been. Well, you remember he had been the NWO referee,
right?
So that's what this was playing on. That Vince had one more WCW ace in his sleeve left, and the last man standing in the war between WWF and WCW, the sole survivor was senior referee Nick Patrick. As he made it out here, Vince called him out. But before Nick Patrick could do the deed, we had another ghost of WCW past and man we saw earlier on this show throughout the night. Make sure that didn't happen.
Ric Flair pulls Nick Patrick out of the ring. Flair punches Nick Patrick out. Vince punches Flair out.
Well, nobody sells a punch better than Nick Patrick, by the way. That
was great.
A god among men for selling a punch as a heel referee.
Vince throws Flair into the post, and Flair takes a bump off this post like he was shot. And yes, it was so great. Flair is still the man, and I have no idea why he is not wrestling on this show.
Exactly. That was my thought as we watched the show, and then particularly as that happened, how is this man just a backstage 50-50 partner and not one of the featured guys on this show?
It was unbelievable. But back in the ring, Austin ends up hitting a low blow on Jericho. Austin goes outside to beat up Vince. But back in the ring, Austin's in control of Jericho, puts Jericho into the walls. He's tapping, no referee. That's the second time in two matches where Chris Jericho has lost via visual pinfall or submission
or submission, but it doesn't count.
Doesn't count. And Booker T does a run in here, hits Austin with the belt in the back of the head.
He doesn't work here, they
Yeah,
scream.
everybody's yelling he
Because
doesn't work here
because all of a
apparently.
sudden we're like having an invasion again or something. Like what? What is this?
No, you already blew this. You don't get to do it again. And then Vince throws Hebner back into the ring. Jericho covers Austin for the win, and the new undisputed champion is Chris Jericho.
As JR yells, "This can't happen! This can't happen!" As the long drawn out 3 count from an addled Earl Hebner, and as you said, Chris Jericho wins the undisputed championship with the help of Vince and Booker T, and he actually lost via visual pinfall or submission to each guy that he beat. And then the show ends with Lawler talking about Vince McMahon laughing last. So in theory, on paper, this was like the crowning night of Chris Jericho's career, but really it was just another Vince gets the last laugh. The other thing I want to mention is that they kept talking throughout this about how Vince McMahon couldn't afford to have Steve Austin win the title. Why?
Right.
what the merch sales would have gone too high? Right. Like what was the peril that he was in here?
It was tough. The Vince and not I didn't have enough backstory on Vince and Steve Austin's story at this point.
I mean, we know the general story of Vince and Austin through the years, through the 90s, but
yeah,
like,
but
what
earlier
was the
that
threat
year,
here?
No, it doesn't make any sense. But
well, because they were together too. We had
they were together at WrestleMania.
Yeah,
so
it was.
Vince is laughing last and loud, and confetti is falling. There's fireworks, which I did enjoy the celebration, and Vince and Jericho, they're celebrating as we go off the air. Like you mentioned, this should have been a crowning achievement for Chris Jericho. However, they wouldn't let him, really beat anybody without showing that the other guy really could have beat him, or he couldn't have beat him without
continued once he was
interference.
champion.
Yeah, so
that was not this was not an isolated incident this one evening with the way Chris Jericho was presented as, in theory, the biggest star in the history of pro wrestling. He should have been from a storyline perspective, because he had just unified the WWF and not WCW world titles for the first time. He had just, as he said, done something, that even Ric Flair hadn't been able to do.
For me, it was too much interference, and it was not the way to elevate Jericho to this position. The crowd reaction overall was the same as the viewers. It all fell flat at the end.
Yes, I would agree with that. I think that it was, if this was something that they were doing and they weren't spending the whole show and the build up to the show promoting this as like the biggest night in wrestling history because you're going to be unifying there's finally going to be one world champion, maybe it wouldn't have come off as flat. But particularly when you look at it through the context of how much they had completely flubbed everything leading up to this, and this should have been, the culminating moment in the invasion and unifying the belts, it falls even more flat through that lens.
Best match on the show for you?
I would say, to me, it's pretty easy. RVD and Undertaker for the hardcore title. I greatly enjoyed what we got of Steve Austin and Kurt Angle, and I thought that was like the best work on the show, but it was, like we talked about, a little short, a little bit of a flat ending, and we know what those two guys were capable of doing with each other. Whereas if you close your eyes and imagine a Undertaker Rob Van Dam match for the hardcore title, this was sort of at the peak level of what that could be. So I'll go Taker and RVD.
For me, it was Rock and Jericho. I had so much fun watching that match. I really enjoyed both those guys, and I thought the work was fantastic. There was a lot to love about it. And yeah, I really enjoyed Rock and Jericho. That was my best match. Worst match, I think, undisputed Trish and Jackie. It was just a nothing. It was a 0. And Jerry Lawler helped make it memorable.
For all the wrong reasons. I would agree. I feel bad kind of saying it because they were put into a position where it could not have been anything other than perceived as the worst match on the show, almost no matter what they did. So I will say that I will grant you that and say you're probably right, but I will go with the Dudleys against Big Show and Kane.
Very fair, yep.
Because I thought the match was just nothing, and as I talked about, the idea that the faces were for no apparent reason,
for no reason,
attempting to assault the manager who was not doing anything wrong and we had not been told had done anything wrong, that segment did not work for me at all. And when I say segment, I actually feel like that's a good way of describing a lot of this show, because outside of the main stuff, and even really the way the main stuff played out, this felt like an extended episode of Raw from that time period more than the big blowaway pay-per-view that it was presented as going in.
Every single Thursday, we will post on social media what event that week's episode will cover. Make sure you're following us on all the platforms. That's Twitter and Instagram at WrestleAtRandom, Facebook.com/WrestlingAtRandom. And of course, the website that brings you this show, it's WrestlingAtRandom.com. There you can find all the links to subscribe to this podcast by your podcatcher of choice. Make sure you subscribe, rate, review, help others find this show. Tell your wrestling fan friends about us. Tell your friends who used to be wrestling fans who maybe don't even watch anymore to come take a trip down memory lane with us. You can also find the links to our YouTube and other things all, again, at WrestlingAtRandom.com. And with that, we're going to wrap it up. Adam, thanks for joining us.
Absolutely. Thank you, Jeremy. This was a walk down memory lane that I certainly don't think I would have ever chosen to take if the randomizer hadn't brought this into my life. But I'm glad that we did. It was an interesting evening, to say the least.
It definitely was. And I want to thank everyone for listening. And we'll talk to you again next time.